Hello and welcome back. Now that you're here, we can start up a new discussion. This time it's about the supreme expression of Jujutsu that traps targets in a realm completely controlled by the caster. Domain expansion. A technique that has quickly become one of the most iconic abilities in anime history. We're going to go over practically everything there is to know about them in this video and talk about the various counters to domains in the next video. Without further delay, let's get into it. Domain expansion is an extremely powerful barrier technique that requires so much cursed energy that it's impossible to use continuously for any extended period of time, and in most cases leaves the caster incapable of using their technique for a while afterwards, meaning that domains play the role of a risky final trump card that wagers everything on ending the fight quickly. This is reflected by both the sheer power of the technique, but also the various ways that using a domain invites immense drawbacks into the fight. But before we get too deep into the specifics, let's go over more of the basic concepts. Casting a domain expansion essentially projects a curse user's innate domain into the real world, and typically seals it within a barrier that acts as a pocket dimension to accommodate the breach of the laws of physics and prevent the escape of any targets, which is especially important considering the vulnerable state the user of a domain is left in following the dissolution of the barrier. A sorcerer who escapes from a domain expansion can capitalize on this vulnerable state, essentially meaning that once someone has casted a domain, their target's escaping the barrier is a death sentence and an automatic loss for them. A curse user's innate domain is a realm that reflects their mind and soul. We most commonly see Sukuna's innate domain as early as chapter 8 or episode 4. The barrier of a domain expansion is a black sphere that is drastically smaller than its interior due to the spatial manipulation at play. In some cases, it can even shrink to the point that it would be impossible for the caster and targets to actually fit within its surface area. The sphere can be moved while the barrier is active by shifting the coordinates that the barrier is expanded across within actual space, effectively having the domain open in a completely different area relative to where it closed, assuming that the user is competent enough to accomplish this. Due to the nature of an innate domain being particularly suited to the caster, its environmental factors empower the user's physical and sorcery capabilities, in addition to allowing for a curse technique to be imbued into the barrier that manifests within the innate domain that has been expanded into the material world. This imbued technique will typically target everything that has cursed energy within the barrier and warp reality to ensure that the effect always lands. For example, in Dagon's domain, even though it summons Shikigami to attack the targets, they don't actually exist until they've already made contact with the target. The domain works this way to ensure that they cannot be dodged or stopped before hitting their target. It is possible for the casting of a domain expansion to designate targets for the technique's sure hit effect instead of the technique indiscriminately attacking all other beings within the barrier, which can be viewed as the default method of targeting. But typically, it is far too difficult for the majority of curse users to direct their domain targets, and the more practical method to avoid collateral damage is to exclude the unwanted targets from the barrier's construction. This process harmlessly pushes them outside of the domain space. By contrast, this method seems to be simple enough that even those who have never used a domain before can accomplish it, as shown when Mahito first used his domain expansion against Nanami and excluded Yuji to avoid Sukuna's retaliation. Almost every domain expansion requires a unique set of hand seals and a chant to cast. Granted, there are some curse users like Dagon and Higuruma who don't seem to require them at all, although in the latter's case there is still a specific gesture required. This demonstrates the sheer complexity of casting a domain when you consider that Jujutsu is a minimalistic art of subtraction. In other words, the better you are at Jujutsu sorcery, the less you'd typically be required to do when casting it. This is perfectly showcased by Sukuna, who effortlessly deploys his innate technique, but even the King of Curses has to use visible hand signs and chant the domain's name in order to effectively use it. Even when pressured by Gojo's 5 consecutive domain expansions, Sukuna never attempts attempted to skip these steps, indicating to the audience that they are either impossible to skip or would sacrifice so much energy or domain quality that they aren't worth discarding altogether. Although domain expansion is the supreme art of Jujutsu and is often considered to be the absolute pinnacle of the power system, there are a variety of ways that inferior curse users can still employ this power in the form of an incomplete domain. Typically, there are two types of incomplete domains, one that lacks the proper installation of a curse technique, and one that lacks the proper enclosement of a barrier to generate the reality warping properties of a sure hit effect. These two incomplete domain types still grant a measure of benefit, but have their own drawbacks and overall lack the overwhelming power of a true domain. Domains that are cast without imbuing techniques into them can often be several times larger and last much longer than normal domains, but naturally aren't nearly as deadly, as they only serve to manipulate environmental factors, which can still amount to a significant advantage in some circumstances, but it is very likely not worth the cursed energy investment. Domains that are cast without proper barrier knowledge will result in an incomplete domain that still vastly empowers the user and their curse technique, similar to the benefits of landing a black flash. However, it can only be done in specific areas that could serve as the barrier for the domain, such as a cave or building interior of sufficient size. We are shown a direct comparison at the end of Season 1 that incomplete domains with techniques are vastly superior to incomplete domains without a technique, which is consistent with the philosophy that domains are meant to be inherently risky. The Yasuhachi Bridge Curse's domain was much more stable and consistent, even being used over a long term, but it lacked the risks of a true domain and consequently wasn't able to confer the type of power that Megumi gained when he used his incomplete domain that risked his technique to burn out and all of his remaining cursed energy, despite the fact that Megumi didn't know any barrier techniques to close the domain. Now that we've established the concept of domain expansion and the minor forms that it can be expressed through, it's time to discuss the two main types of domains and the two ways their barriers can be expressed when they are cast by a true master of domain expansion. The first type of domain and the most common throughout the series is the lethal domain, which typically is a harmful effect meant to damage or kill the target that is guaranteed to take effect and successfully hit. Examples of lethal domains are Jogo's Coffin of the Iron Mountain and Mahito's Self-Embodiment of Perfection, which target every being within the isolated space of the barrier and attack them with a technique that will always hit. These domains are the most difficult to create and require the most skill and refinement of cursed energy and jujutsu principles to learn, which is why historically they've always been quite rare compared to their non-lethal counterparts. A non-lethal domain typically has the advantage when it comes to activation speed and strength when clashing with other domains due to the simplicity of their casting, allowing for easier use. In other words, the lethal domain has to expend far more talent and effort to accomplish the same task, so winning a clash is consequently more difficult for a sorcerer who has to manage the far more complex lethal domain. As the name implies, non-lethal domain expansions do not target beings with attacks meant to kill, but rather they are targeted by information that explains the rules and conditions of the domain. These conditions will either force a specific course of action, such as restricting violence, or they will provide a set goal that one or more of the domain's inhabitants will attempt to accomplish for a reward. Essentially, non-lethal domains create a game environment that shifts the win condition of the battle from a regular fight to a contest that the domain's caster is uniquely suited to win. For example, Hakari's domain, Idle Death Gamble, is highly complex and powerful once the conditions are met. So in order to balance out the power of the domain's jackpot reward, anyone captured within the domain is immediately made aware of the rules of Hakari's pachinko machine so that they can react accordingly, typically by trying to kill him before he can get to the jackpot, which creates a game where Hakari has to get lucky before he dies, which is uniquely suited to his cartoonish luck. Similarly, Higuruma's domain, Deadly Sentencing, forbids and negates all forms of aggression and forces both parties to act out their roles as the prosecutor and accused in a courtroom, which allows Higuruma to leverage his particular skills and knowledge to gain an insurmountable advantage against even those who might normally stomp him in a traditional jujutsu battle. These abilities aren't nearly as immediately deadly as something like Malevolent Shrine, but in return they are extremely refined and practically guarantee victory if their conditions are properly met. Coming back to the two ways that true domains can be expressed, there are traditional domains with closed barriers that are nearly impossible to break free of, even if the target can find the boundaries from within due to their incredible durability. And finally, the open barrier domain is regarded as a divine technique, as it is capable of expanding the innate domain of the caster over real space instead of the isolated domain barrier of the traditional domain. Incomplete domains like Megumis cannot deploy a sure-hit effect due to their lack of a barrier, but in the case of Sukuna and Kenjaku, they can create barriers that serve only as borders to their domain and don't actually separate reality from their innate domain space. The divine open barrier domain allows for the possibility of escape, and in return it enjoys a drastically higher range and a significant advantage in domain clashes due to domain barriers typically being as weak on the outside as they are strong on the inside. Domain clashes occur when one space has two or more innate domains expanded across it, causing a power struggle between them. There are many complex factors that determine the winner of such a clash, such as refinement, activation speed, power level, barrier type, binding vows, whether the domain is lethal or not, and how well the casters are able to maintain their domains, just to name a few. Notably, these factors become endlessly more complicated with each additional domain involved. Even just 3 barriers cause such a complex and unstable clash that it's nearly impossible for any one barrier to manifest properly. Domain clashes can result in one domain claiming dominance, all domains failing, or one domain having a hole torn through it, allowing for the captured targets to have an opportunity to escape as long as the weaker domain is maintained. In addition, it is possible for 2 domains to be evenly matched for a prolonged period of time, but as soon as one of the 2 casters is damaged significantly, their domain will fail. Domains are so complex and cursed energy intensive that only characters with effectively endless energy like Gojo, Sukuna, and sometimes Hikari can possibly manage to use more than one per day. Even Yuta, who can summon Rika to temporarily refill his energy reserves and have effectively endless energy, claims that he can't use more than one in a day, most likely due to the burnout that follows the dissolution of a domain's barrier. Cursed technique burnout occurs when a sorcerer imbues their technique into a barrier, and the barrier eventually breaks or dissolves, causing the imbued technique to be overheated and non-functional for a period of time. This period isn't strictly defined and is most likely dependent on a case-by-case basis, as we've seen burnout times fluctuate before. Technique burnout can only be bypassed with an extremely risky application of cursed energy to destroy a small piece of the caster's brain near the right prefrontal cortex, and then immediately recreating the piece via reverse curse technique. This is essentially the equivalent of destroying and rebuilding an overheated car just to cool the engine down, which is as insane in practice as it sounds. Even 2 of the greatest sorcerers to ever live can't pull it off without risking permanent brain damage. This brain damage was depicted as comparable to the limitless sensory information that Gojo's domain forces on its targets. Besides initiating a domain clash, there are a few countermeasures which can be taken to increase one's chance of surviving a lethal domain. However, these countermeasures will be left for the next video. In conclusion, domain expansions are the pinnacle of Jujutsu sorcery, and they are nearly as complex as the power system itself, allowing for a climactic finish to any battle. I especially appreciate how domains serve as a time limit on most battles to prevent them from dragging on too long. In keeping with the themes of Jujutsu Kaisen and cursed energy, it's incredibly fitting that to express their ultimate power, a sorcerer has to open themselves up to risking everything. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video and tell me what you want to hear about next, and I hope you're looking forward to hearing about simple domains and domain amplification in Falling Blossom Emotion next time. But either way, I hope you stay safe and take it easy.